Well, welcome back, everyone, and thank you very much, Lennon, for the fantastic presentation spotlighting the case of Peru. Next, we will turn to two international experts whom Beatriz and Luis already introduced earlier in the day, Dr. Gavin Hilson and Dr. Felix Hruschka. Dr. Hruschka and Dr. Hilson have expertise in small-scale mining that spans the globe, including South America, Africa, Europe, Mongolia, and so on. And they will round out Lennon's presentation by first presenting just a few remarks from their collective experience on big picture lessons learned when it comes to formalization from across the countries in which they've worked. They'll each present for about 7 minutes, and then I will ask them a few questions in a fireside chat style discussion. After that discussion, we will have a chance to break out into small groups to react to what you have heard so far. And then we'll all come back together in a plenary and have a discussion with Lennon, with Felix, and with Gavin, where you'll be able to ask questions of all three experts. So with that, I would invite Felix and Gavin to turn on your cameras, and I will turn the floor to Felix to present on formalization. Over to you, Felix.
Thank you. Muchas gracias, Julia. ¿Usted me escucha? ¿Van a correr la presentación desde allá o yo lo comparto mi pantalla?
Sí, Félix, estamos viéndote y estamos viendo la presentación.
Sí, pero no es mi bueno, no es tan... Ok, si ustedes manejan la presentación, les voy a decir el siguiente slide. Bien.
Perdón,
Ok.
interrumpo, Félix. Si tú quieres presentar desde tu computador, lo puedes hacer, si te sientes más tranquilo.
O como quieran, como quieran.
Ok, entonces dejemos esta. Ok.
Dejemos esta. Bien. Entonces, muy bien. Primer slide, por favor. Vamos al siguiente. Bueno, si ustedes me preguntan por el país donde se ha resuelto el reto de la formalización, tengo que decepcionarles de alguna manera. No conozco en realidad ninguno. Lo que sí hay avances y hay retrocesos. Y de eso se puede aprender lecciones valiosas. Voy a intentar de resumir algunas que me parecen claves y que, por supuesto, no son recetas, sino, bueno, simplemente experiencias, porque cada país es en realidad diferente. Siguiente, por favor. Ya. Primero, necesitamos claridad sobre lo que estamos hablando. Se necesita definir el sector de la minería artesanal y de la pequeña escala, la MAPE. La MAPE se diferencia de la minería industrial, digamos como un carpintero de una fábrica de muebles, pero ambas se necesitan. Lo que tiene común en todos los países es que la MAPE consiste de una amplia gama de escalas de operación, desde lo individual y manual hasta lo organizado y mecanizado. Los países pioneros en formalización, que tienen legislaciones que datan desde los años 90, 80 o inclusive más antes, tal como por ejemplo Bolivia, Ghana, Filipinas, o por lo general reconocen la MAPE como un solo sector de pequeña minería. Pero esto raras veces refleja las variadas realidades que existen, como la extracción manual, semimecanizada o mecanizada, la dedicación como profesión a tiempo completo o a tiempo parcial para complementar ingresos rurales, o como actividad individual o colectiva. Hay muchas. Y mientras la legislación no cubre todas estas realidades, siempre habrá grupos que se quedan fuera de la formalización. Por eso hoy en día es más común una diferenciación en dos estratos, minería artesanal y pequeña minería. Y se puede observar que lo más granular el espectro de escalas está reflejado en la legislación minera. Mediante estratos de la MAPE bien definidas, lo más exitosos son por lo general los esfuerzos de la formalización. De esto una lección aprendida. Solamente lo que está claramente definido en la ley se puede formalizar. Personalmente pienso que hasta se necesita 3 estratos: estrato de subsistencia, artesanal y pequeños. Y esto me lleva a otro tema que es el crecimiento. La siguiente, por favor. Algunos mineros aspiran trabajando de forma tradicional. Otros quieren crecer y tener éxito económico. Ambas aspiraciones son legítimas. Muchas legislaciones, a cambio, impiden el crecimiento y establecen multas si un minero excede el límite de su producción o mejora su tecnología más allá de lo que prescribe la legislación para su estrato. Esto es un poco absurdo. Si un startup tiene éxito y crece, se lo felicita. Si un minero artesanal hace lo mismo, se le multa. Bueno, la estratificación del MAPE, por lo tanto, debe permitir la transición a estratos de mayor productividad y tecnología avanzada. Perú o Tanzania, por ejemplo, lo permiten y lo ha sucedido en varios casos. El mecanismo es sencillo. La operación ya no se califica como artesanal, sino como pequeña o mediana, y conforme las obligaciones aumentan, conforme a la escala. Lección aprendida. Importante es que la legislación debe procurar y hasta promover la posibilidad de crecimiento de la minería artesanal hacia pequeña y hacia mediana. Siempre, por supuesto, con mayor derecho, mayor obligación. La siguiente, por favor. Esto nos lleva al tema de obligaciones directamente. La principal razón de definir escalas de minería es poder establecer obligaciones diferenciales. Los más altos para la minería industrializada, que utiliza tecnología de punta, adecuadamente menos exigentes para los sectores más populares de la MAPE. Los problemas comienzan cuando los requisitos se vuelven inalcanzables, o sea, imposibles de cumplir, o por demandar un esfuerzo que no mantiene una relación costo-beneficio razonable. A veces los requisitos son demasiado exigentes y se los podría simplificar sustancialmente, pero con el afán de hacer bien las cosas, muchas administraciones mineras a veces lo hacen lo contrario. Lección aprendidas. Mejor un requisito sencillo y fácil de cumplir, cumplido por muchos, que un requisito muy completo, muy complejo y elaborado, cumplido por muy pocos. Esto aplica sobre todo al nivel de entrada a la formalización. Por supuesto, como he dicho antes, con mayor derecho, mayor obligación. Y otra lección aprendida referente a las obligaciones es que la formalización siempre debe significar una ventaja para el minero. No solamente obligaciones. Si no hay incentivo, el minero no se va a formalizar. Siguiente, por favor. Esto es relacionado con la capacidad de la administración minera. En alguna forma lo hemos escuchado ya de Lenin, esta lección aprendida. Lo que a veces pasa es que se establece requisitos que crean cargas de trabajo para las mismas autoridades, encima de su capacidad y resultando que no están en capacidad de procesar las solicitudes o instrumentos en un plazo prudente. Tendría muchos ejemplos para contar, pero el tiempo no alcanza. Solamente la lección aprendida. Al establecer requisitos o obligaciones legales, hay que procurar que a la vez la autoridad competente tiene los recursos suficientes para responder oportunamente y exigir su cumplimiento. Me refiero a recursos financieros, recursos personales, recursos técnicos, todo esto. Porque plazos largos de respuesta o débil exigencia de cumplimiento reducen significativamente la credibilidad de las autoridades y, en consecuencia, el respeto a la ley. Siguiente, por favor. Para que respete la ley, hay que procurar a la vez que los mineros conocen la ley. Viven en zonas remotas, no tienen la formación profesional para leer y entender textos legales. Pero no solamente para la capacitación, sino también para procurar que los mineros tengan acceso a los servicios que la autoridad brinda, sigue imprescindible la presencia de las autoridades en el terreno mediante servicios de extensión. Muchos países, por lo tanto, prevén también un rol activo de las alcaldías municipales en la formalización del sector. Las ventajas son la presencia permanente en el territorio y que a nivel local se conocen los actores. Solamente un ejemplo, en Mongolia, por ejemplo, todos los trámites para la minería artesanal son ante el municipio. El municipio luego lo tramita ante las autoridades nacionales. En áreas ya concesionadas a empresas se firman acuerdos tripartitos entre mineros, empresa y municipio. Esto, por la licencia social misma, inclusive ayuda en la negociación con las empresas. Lección aprendida. La presencia local es clave. Esto quiere servicios de extensión de las autoridades del sector y puede ser fortalecido mediante el involucramiento de gobiernos locales. Obviamente, esta delegación de funciones debe estar acompañado con la asignación de los recursos necesarios. Igual capacidad administrativa, como dicho anterior. Siguiente, por favor. Todo lo anterior resuelto, digamos, queda un obstáculo principal, áreas libres. En muchos países existen concesiones enormes de miles de kilómetros cuadrados, de las cuales solamente una mínima parte está en operación. Asimismo, existe una gran cantidad de concesiones más pequeñas que se mantienen con fines de especulación o de cobrar regalías a mineros informales. En la práctica quedan pocas áreas libres. En las áreas ocupadas, el éxito de formalización depende de la voluntad de los propietarios de las concesiones. Y por ser un gran negocio, no siempre existe esta buena voluntad. Diferentes modelos de subcontratación existen, estos solo perpetúan el problema de la falta de áreas libres donde se puede formalizar la MAPE. Es por eso que países han desarrollado diferentes mecanismos para recuperar las áreas ocupadas, pero no productivas. Por ejemplo, en Tanzania, si bien me recuerdo, cada año los concesionarios tienen que devolver un cierto porcentaje de sus concesiones de prospección y exploración que no entran en operación. En Perú, por otro lado, se busca la devolución de áreas no productivas mediante un incremento progresivo del costo de la vigencia. Lección aprendida. Una, digamos, plena formalización sin dependencia de terceros solo es posible en áreas libres. Se necesitan mecanismos de devolución de áreas no productivas para entregarlas a los mineros presentes en estas áreas. Y el último, siguiente, por favor. Siguiente diapositiva, gracias. Hay muchos aspectos más, el tiempo es corto. Solamente un comentario final relacionado al concepto de formalización mismo. Formalización es un proceso permanente y perpetuo. Para los mineros, luego de haber obtenido acceso legal al recurso mineral, la legalización, es un largo proceso de mejoras continuas. Y para el Estado, es una tarea permanente porque viejas minas se cierran y nuevas minas se abren. En la industrial, igual que en la pequeña artesanal y subsistencia. Esto significa para el Estado, formalización de la MAPE no se logra mediante campañas. Escuchar, a mi saber, ha habido mucho en Colombia a lo largo de las décadas pasadas, sino mediante continuidad y persistencia. Esto requiere estructuras e institucionalidad estable. Así, mis primeros comentarios. Disculpen si me he extendido un poco más allá de los 7 minutos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Felix, for that really interesting presentation. Next, we will go to Gavin to
Escuchamos,
share.
pero sí necesitamos que saquen esa...
All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to offer some reflections on formalizing artisanal and small-scale mining in sub-Saharan Africa, where I've done most of my work over the past 20 or so years. Just a few quick thoughts. This is a question that keeps coming up. Is formalization of ASM the silver bullet? And there's a lot of critique and a lot of perspectives that are being shared on whether this is the case. And the problem is we're in no position to answer this question because we really haven't formalized anything. The question that should be asked is, are the processes that we're following to facilitate formalization appropriate? And I think we know the answer to that because not much has been formalized. In the case of sub-Saharan Africa, I always talk about the barriers because they're glaring and they're very obvious. Felix has alluded to some of this already. In some of the cases in South America and Asia, it's pretty much universal across the board, but it's particularly prominent in sub-Saharan Africa. There's several barriers. I've identified 4 main ones here. The first is licensing fees. They're just exorbitant, these licensing fees. So if you're looking at it from a legalist perspective, very simply, if you want to formalize and have access to all those services and support that a registered business in theory has access to, the finance, the technology, etc. If you want to be in a position to qualify for some of this lending and support, you need a license, and this is a big problem. Most of these most of these NGOs and most of these donors will not deal with you and will not include you in any of their programs unless you have a license. The problem is the whole process of getting a license in most African countries, from Ghana to Zimbabwe to Sierra Leone, there's a lot of rent seeking around that process. So governments are making significant amounts of money. On the one hand, attending international conferences, calling this sector a poverty-driven sector, and on the other hand, charging thousands and thousands of dollars for licenses. And there's a bureaucracy that's firmly entrenched. You know, you have to pay numerous bribes in order to get, you know, your application looked at, in order to expedite decisions on your applications. You have to go from ministry to ministry. In most countries in Africa now, this is a cross-ministerial exercise, getting a license, which has made it even more difficult to get a license. So there's a huge bureaucracy that has to be navigated. And you can look at some of the cadastres online, and you'll see that there's just very few people who have managed to get a license. And it's all because of this bureaucracy and the exorbitant licensing fees. This is another barrier that's emerged. I think it's very significant. It's become quite prominent in recent years. The troubles with graduating. There's this push around the world, not only in Africa, but around the world, to create new categories of small scale mining and medium scale mining. The problem is that to graduate from one to the next in countries where this strategy has been operationalized, like Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Mozambique, for example, you have to carry out an environmental impact assessment or comprehensive impact assessments in order to qualify for the next category of license. That costs an enormous amount of money. So if we're going to recategorize this mining activity, I understand, I get it. You know, you can't compare the person panning on the side of a river in Burkina Faso to the person who has an excavator in Ghana. If we're calling that small scale mining, it may be a case of us having to recategorize this sector and come up with different types of licenses, but don't make graduating to the next step or the next stage a barrier. Don't impose all these barriers to graduating to the next stage. What happens in a lot of these countries, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Mozambique, for example, is people who are mining, say, at the artisanal level. In the case of Liberia, it's a Class C license. They're not allowed to use heavy machinery. And if they want to use heavy machinery, they have to graduate to the next category of license, and they have to pay $10,000 or $20,000, which they don't have. So they're really sort of constrained when it comes to production. The last is what I refer to as the large-scale mining bias. This is the elephant in the room everywhere. Governments are trying to extract rents and extract fees from large-scale mining. I get it. And it's not just the mines that we're talking about, because if we're talking about gold mining, for example, in some of the biggest producers in Africa, we're only talking about 12, 15 operational gold mines. And that's the sector in terms of production. Now, that obviously occupies not necessarily collectively a sizable proportion of land, but it's the exploration facility that sustains that and catalyzes that production that we have to look at. Hundreds and hundreds of exploration leases. It's quick money for governments. $10,000 here, you want to renew it, $20,000 here. So there's sort of a culture of rent seeking that's emerged around this. And you know, the proof is there online. If you look at some of the concessions, like, I mean, if you're a small scale miner and you want to get a license, and say you're genuinely committed to getting a license, where are you going to get a license? The entire land is under concession to large scale mining companies and mineral exploration companies. It's very, very challenging. So even if you're willing to pay that money, if you're willing to navigate the bureaucracy, where on earth are you going to get a concession? These are just some examples here. They're all online. Zambia, Guinea, Ghana, Burkina. The entire country is pretty much under concession to mineral exploration and mining companies. So it's very difficult to have a conversation with a government, which is, you know, let's put the corruption aside, let's put the accusations aside. A government that is, a government of a poor country that's desperate to attract foreign investment. If you don't have to lift a finger and you're generating revenue by just simply signing a paper and giving a parcel of land over to a mineral exploration company or a mining company, and you're getting thousands and thousands of dollars, you know, it's very difficult to have a conversation with the same government about, oh, well, you know, if you formalize this activity, if you do X, Y, and Z, 10,000 people can get a license and work as small scale miners, so they'll live happily ever after. It's very difficult to have that conversation with the government, because, you know, they're obviously seeing immediate returns from promoting large scale mining, and they don't really see immediate returns with small scale mining. So, I mean, it's right here is just some examples. This is Cote d'Ivoire, which is one of the more appealing destinations these days for foreign large-scale mining companies and mineral exploration companies. Let me wrap up with a few case studies. I think this is really important. I mean, we've been talking about formalization for decades, and we need sort of a fresh narrative. And this is sort of how I try to approach this when I speak to donors and I speak to governments, and the response is like, oh no, we've been there, done that. I get the poverty driven angle, I get the employment angle, but it's not really resonating anymore. I mean, 20 years ago it did, but we need a new storyline. So this is what I've been thinking, you know, for the first part of my career, first half of my career, I would sort of get emotional and I would talk about how we need to support these people, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not going to facilitate change in the donor community or at the government level. You really need to find new pressure points. You need to find a new storyline and a new narrative. And that's what I've been thinking about quite a lot over the past decade. And I think the way you sort of approach this is you think of it as a process. It's not just about getting a license. And the UN has been very good in this, in sort of, trying to get us to think more about formalization as a process, as opposed to just getting a license in this context. Like formalization in theory, licensing is a part of it, but in theory, it should open up all these other doors, put these miners in a position to pay taxes, and contribute to sustainable development in other ways. Speaking of sustainable development, I mean, there are a lot of themes that are the flavors of the month in the donor community. Things like food security, things like gender empowerment, very, very important development issues. I think packaging packaging formalization of ASM, using these ideas is the way forward. If you're able to demonstrate, as is the case in Africa, that formalization of small scale mining, i.e. putting mining in a position to contribute more concretely and more tangibly to local economies and national economies through formalization, you put miners and people and communities in a position to contribute positively to food security. It's sustaining. There's been a lot of research done that demonstrates in Africa that these two activities, farming and small scale mining, dovetail one another, that they're inseparable. When you're not farming, you're mining. When you're not mining, you're farming. And obviously the revenue from mining is being used to sustain agriculture. It's being used in times when there's droughts in places like Malawi or Burkina Faso, the Sahelian region. The money from mining is being used to buy food. So there's a crucial food security angle that you can sort of attack when you attempt to rewrite the narrative on ASM formalization. Same with gender as well. I mean, there's a lot of, it's long overdue, but there's a huge focus now on the involvement and the role played by women in this sector, which is great. They're getting a lot of attention, and this is another way we can sort of repackage formalization to ensure that it has an impact in the donor space. Let me wrap up with a couple case studies that are inspirational, I think, because there's been a lot of negative press about small scale mining over the past few decades. But I think these three cases are really good examples of I guess cases that are inspirational, that even in the most extreme of cases, we can really accomplish a lot and have accomplished a lot, starting with virtually nothing. The Zambia model, or what I refer to as the Zambia model, this is really interesting because there's been a few gold rushes in Zambia in recent years. It's not traditionally, it has never really been a gold mining country. It's mined a lot of copper. It's a huge copper producer, and a lot of gemstones. And when these gold rushes emerged in Zambia about 10 years ago, what the government did was it quickly instituted a legal framework, passed a law where you were required to get a panning certificate, and it made this a cross-ministerial exercise, involved the Bank of Zambia in purchasing, got a few other government units involved, the Geological Survey involved, to produce this institutional, that gave rise to this institutional framework that proved to be, or provided the bedrock for a formalized small-scale mining sector in the case of gold. There's been some setbacks, but what this shows me, and what this has shown a number of people, is that if you really want to do it, I mean, in this country where all the focus is on everything else, there's no resources to do anything else but support copper mining or gemstone mining. This shows me that if you really want to do it, you can do it. So there's no excuses for the likes of Peru or the likes of Ghana or the likes of Colombia in this case, because your focus is on gold mining, and you are targeting gold mining, and it's a point of emphasis in your development strategies. So this is a country where gold mining isn't a point of emphasis, and they've managed to do something really, really significant in a very short period of time. The community mining scheme in Ghana, this is really interesting as well. I describe this as the best example of accidental good governance in the small scale mining sector in Africa. And the reason why I describe it as such is this is a country where the government has been playing large scale mining against small scale mining for decades. It refuses to license small scale miners. It watches small scale miners apply for licenses to work in particular areas, allows them to work in those particular areas, and then kicks them off when they discover gold and gives that parcel of land to exploration companies, and they generate revenue that way. So it's no secret that this is happening in Ghana, but what the government did in order to win votes in the last election or before the last election was it instituted this community mining scheme, which the donors have now heard a lot about and have showcased in their projects, you know, making this a point of emphasis. And what this community mining scheme is it basically decentralizes the setup for small scale mining and decentralizes the licensing system. And how it does that is it's the local government units, the district assemblies, that absorb all the costs and navigates the bureaucracy and endures all the nonsense that individual miners, individual applicants have traditionally endured to get a license. And it's just rests with them because they want to appease their constituents. They want to make sure that everyone in their area has a license because they want to stay in power. So they actually do the dirty work. And once those community mining schemes are awarded, and lots of them have been awarded, it's the district assembly that manages everything. There's a fund there. The labor's managed, it's regulated, everyone's licensed, and everyone's happy. So, you know, I've been working in Ghana for over 20 years, and I'd given up on pretty much everything in that country linked to small scale mining. And then all of a sudden this thing emerged, the community mining scheme. And now I'm very, very encouraged by what's going on and what will happen, what I believe will happen over the next 5 years or so. The last example here is, you know, there's a lot of countries, and I'm sure in Latin America as well, there's a lot of countries that have these corridors or blocked out areas for small scale mining. The problem is that even when they are blocked out in places like the Congo and places like Mozambique, if you go and work in those corridors, there's no security of tenure, because if a large scale mining company wants to secure that part or obtain a part of that area or work that part of that area, the law states that they can do that. They can acquire it, and you as a small scale miner, even though you're licensed to work in the designated area, you have to leave. In Mali, it's different. And why this is so interesting is Mali is a very interesting country in the sense that the national government, the government is not involved in small scale mining or artisanal mining activity at all. It doesn't regulate it at all. It's regulated in the traditional economy by the mayors and the people at the local level. And since the first laws for mining were drafted by the French during the colonial period, there's been this requirement in the law for, based on observations made in the 1800s of seeing artisanal miners work, et cetera, this requirement that any mining company that comes in has to manage those miners themselves and has to block out an area for them to work if they do scale up to a production stage. What's interesting about that is because the government is completely detached, it's basically the mining company versus the community. And we know who would win that battle. Clearly the community, because they clearly outnumber the mining company. So the mining company has no choice but to, you know, block out an area if it wants to scale up to production, the production phase. So it can't go back to the government and say, can you help me? Can I get some security? Can I get some army people to come in and, you know, sort this out? No, it's up to the company to sort it out. So what's interesting about this is that Mali is a country where seems to be a coup d'etat every week. And despite this, in these communities where these mining companies are operating, you see this sort of good governance taking place. You know, they have this, they have to develop this good relationship with the community, and they have to continue to appease them by allowing them to mine. So these are three cases, I think, you know, we can extract some bits from, and when you sort of put those bits together, we have a best practice strategy. So these are certainly some cases that we can draw some valuable inspiration from. That's all.